Hello students, and welcome back to POLI 101, the Government of Canada. I'm your instructor, Sam. So far we've covered topics of Canadian political culture and French-English relations at depth. Today we have another full lecture, so let's get straight to it. Indigenous politics is the topic that we'll cover in today's lecture, as well as later this week in discussion groups and tutorial groups. This is a vital issue for understanding Canadian politics, because the issue dates all the way back to the colonial period, when European settlers arrived on the continent where Indigenous peoples had already been living for millennia. The intervening centuries of settler colonialism resulted in terrible outcomes for Indigenous populations as they suffered cultural genocide at the hands of the Canadian governments, as well as the British and French colonial governments that had preceded the Canadian Confederation. More recently, after years of treaties, legislation, government programs, inquiries, restitution, legal battles, and financial settlements, there still remains a great deal that is unresolved in relations between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada. Today, we are going to explore those many issues. It's important to note that the issue of Indigenous politics in Canada is an issue on which the whole world is watching. In a recent review from the United Nations Human Rights Council, they found that the Canadian government has had policies over the last few centuries that have constituted human rights violations against Indigenous peoples. These have included the endangerment of Indigenous languages, as well as a failure to provide meaningful consultation regarding development on lands that First Nations peoples have occupied for centuries. There have also been environmentally destructive practices on these lands. We're going to cover the issue of Indigenous languages when we talk about the demography of Indigenous peoples in Canada. We'll discuss the issue of Indigenous peoples' land rights, as well as Canadian government development and resource extraction on those lands when we cover the extensive legal battles that have taken place in Canadian courts over the last 50 years. Overall, we are also going to address what the United Nations Human Rights Council generalized as a legacy of trauma rooted in the colonial relationship, especially the experiences of many Indigenous Canadians in the Indian residential school system. We are going to cover all of these topics today as we achieve our 4 learning objectives. The first of these objectives is to describe the size and distribution of the Indigenous population within Canada, and we're going to do this by examining data from the 2016 census. With this information in hand, we'll proceed to our second objective, and that's to identify how the language of Indigenous politics has changed in the 20th century, and also how the legal definition of Indigenous peoples has expanded to cover First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. After that, we are going to spend a lot of time, 20 slides or so, tracking the evolution of Indigenous policy in Canada, from the colonial period all the way to the present day. Along the way, we are going to focus on topics including the Indian Act of 1876, the reserve system, and the residential school system. Finally, we're going to understand issues related to divided sovereignty and self-government through an examination of the wide range of government commissions and inquiries involving Indigenous peoples, as well as the significant court cases regarding the title to lands historically occupied by Indigenous peoples. In achieving these 4 objectives today, we are going to gain a deep understanding of the significance and importance of Indigenous politics in Canadian society. We begin today's lecture with the demography of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Indigenous peoples are those who can trace their ancestry in what would later become Canada to before the arrival and permanent settlement of Europeans. I chose for this slide only pictures uploaded in the last year. And this is because it's important to correct the false impression that Indigenous peoples somehow belong to the past in Canada. Of course, the history and cultures and traditions of Indigenous peoples across Canada extend well into time immemorial. But it's also important to recognize that Indigenous peoples make up a significant portion of the Canadian population today in 2021, as we can see, of course, from the photos of these in this slide, as well as when we walk out into any city in Canada or into any of the provinces and territories. The Canadian census from 2016 gives us some more specific information about how many Indigenous people live in Canada. First off, it's important to note that the Canadian census uses a definition of Aboriginal, which is a term that we don't commonly see used as much anymore. But for official census purposes, the term Aboriginal comprises those persons who report identification with at least one Indigenous group. And most commonly, we see these groups as the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And we can see that altogether, there are over 1.6 million Indigenous peoples in Canada. Of these, just under 1 million identify as First Nations single identity, a single band or community within the category of First Nations. We then see almost 600,000 individuals identifying as Métis. Finally, there are over 65,000 individuals identifying as Inuit, and we will discuss all three of these groups today. Let's take a look at the distribution of Indigenous peoples across Canadian provinces, territories, and cities. Let's begin near the top of this graph with Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia stands out not because of the overall percentage of its population that are Indigenous peoples, which is what this graph is communicating, but rather because Nova Scotia is the only province in which the number of First Nations and those identifying as Métis is nearly equal. In almost every other province and territory, the number of First Nations individuals outnumbers the number of Métis individuals. If we look at Quebec and Ontario, we see that the overall numbers of Indigenous peoples is actually quite high in aggregate, though as a total amount of the population, it is a small percentage because, of course, Quebec and Ontario are the most populous Canadian provinces. In Manitoba and Saskatchewan, we see a much higher concentration of Indigenous peoples as a portion of the overall population of those provinces. In Alberta, we also see a significant number of Métis individuals and a closer distribution of the First Nations and Métis populations than we see anywhere else except for in Nova Scotia. In British Columbia, however, there are almost twice as many people identifying as First Nations compared to Métis. And in the Yukon, this trend holds consistent. In the Northwest Territories, we do see a significant community of Inuit individuals living in the Western Arctic portion of the Northwest Territories, but this is nothing compared to the territory of Nunavut, which, as we can see from this graph, is majority Inuit, the only territory or province to be majority Inuit. When we look at the city-level data for the Indigenous demography, one trend becomes clear pretty quickly, and that is that the Métis people are overrepresented in the cities compared to their overall populations across the provinces and territories. We see that in the cities of Saskatoon, Montreal, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and the National Capital Region of Ottawa-Gatineau, there are equal numbers of Métis or nearly equal numbers of Métis and First Nations individuals, or in some cases, larger numbers of Métis than First Nations. This is despite the fact that the overall population finds that Métis individuals outnumber vastly that is to say, First Nations individuals vastly outnumber Métis individuals in the overall counts. So what explains this overrepresentation in the cities of Métis? This is primarily because the First Nations reserves, as well as the Inuit reserves and the Inuit territories, are well outside of urban centers. As we'll explore today, the reserve system is found in remote parts of Canada. This has had negative consequences, but this has also had the consequence of helping preserve the culture within those remote communities. We'll explore these issues at greater depth in some coming slides. Let's conclude our learning objective on Indigenous demography with some information related to income, education, and employment for Indigenous peoples in Canada. What we see is that on average, Indigenous peoples in Canada earn about 3/4 of what other non-Indigenous Canadians earn, and are much more likely to fall below the low income line set by Statistics Canada. Depending on the size of the family, this low income line is somewhere between $14,000 and $22,000 per year. Government transfer payments make up about 1/5 of Indigenous income, compared to just about 1/10 of income for non-Indigenous Canadians. Much of this has to do with the educational outcomes that we find among Indigenous people in Canada. About 3 out of 10 Indigenous peoples in Canada have not completed high school. Non-completion rates are even higher for those on reserves, approaching nearly 50%. Compare those two figures to the overall 12% rate among non-Indigenous Canadians who do not complete high school, and we see that there is a clear achievement gap between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians. Those who claim Indigenous identity are also twice as likely as other Canadians to be unemployed. Status Indians, which is a legal category that we'll discuss shortly, those living on reserves are 4 times as likely to be unemployed. So what we see here is that Indigenous Canadians make up a significant portion of the Canadian population, and they are found in all of the provinces and territories in varying concentrations. But we also notice some clear signals about the socioeconomic status of Indigenous Canadians. We're going to explore these issues today in great detail. Our second learning objective today concerns the language of Indigenous politics and the ways in which it has transformed, especially in the second half of the 20th century and the first few decades of the 21st century. Starting in the late 1960s, labels that had previously been considered appropriate and unobjectionable, as well as the concepts and assumptions that were associated with these somewhat antiquated terms, were increasingly questioned. Coinciding with these changes in language about Indigenous peoples and how to have respectful conversations about Indigenous politics, coinciding with these changes was a radical new idea that the path to progress was not in integration, but rather in official recognition and institutionalization of differences between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians. And this included meaningful self-government. We're going to see how linguistic changes coincided with expansion of the recognition of who Indigenous peoples are, as well as their contemporary demands for divided sovereignty and self-government. We're going to define a number of terms, and if you're ever confused about which terms to use in your discussions, in tutorial group, in discussion group, as well as in your written work this semester that you'll submit for this course, make sure to check out the guides that Canadian universities publish on exactly this topic. There are some very helpful guides to terminology that you can find, and I've listed 2 resources here, one from the University of British Columbia and the Indigenous Foundation at UBC, and one from Queen's University and their Office of Indigenous Initiatives. Today, the label Indian continues to be regularly used in Canada by those who are status Indians. But we need to recognize that by the late 1970s to 1980s, the glaring misnomer of Indian had lost favor to terms such as First Nations and Indigenous peoples. Intellectually, the change in language reflected a reappropriation of the identities and the histories of those to whom these descriptions applied. These individuals were not Indians by any stretch of the imagination. They were instead indigenous peoples, the First Nations of North America. So we should recognize that today, terms such as Indian, Aboriginal, and Native are considered outdated and in many contexts potentially disrespectful. We should also be careful to avoid referring to Canada's Indigenous peoples or any other possessive variant thereof. And this is because the Indigenous people do not belong to Canada. This notion that they are Canada's Indigenous people reinforces a paternalistic narrative and also ignores important developments and demands for First Nation sovereignty. Again, if you have any confusion about how to use these terms, make sure to check out those resources that I linked to on the previous slide. What is the significance of these changes in language regarding conversations on Indigenous politics? Well, the terms and labels used in conversation on Indigenous peoples matter symbolically and conceptually. They shape our thinking about to whom they apply, what their histories are, the relationship of Indigenous peoples to the state, as well as to the rest of Canadian society, and about the justice of their arguments and claims, for instance, regarding the historical occupation and use of their lands. But beyond a conceptual and symbolic importance, language change also has practical consequences. The widespread acceptance of the terms First Nations peoples, this carries a political connotation that connotes communal status, communal rights, as well as notions of Indigenous nationalism. This linguistic change, very importantly, has been accompanied by a greater perceived legitimacy of these groups' claims. The proliferation of use in common conversations in Canadian society of the term First Nations is connected not only to these symbolic and conceptual changes, but also to these practical political differences between the old antiquated terms and the new terms of Indigenous politics and First Nations peoples. In contemporary international society, Indigenous has become more widely used since the United Nations 2007 Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's currently the preferred term used by many advocacy groups as well as academics. But it's important to note that there is no international consensus on this terminology. For example, in the United States, the terms First Nations and Indigenous are seldom used. In fact, I had not heard the term First Nations until I moved to Canada in 2008. Similarly, the term Eskimo was long used to refer to the Indigenous people who inhabit the Arctic coasts of Canada, Alaska, Russia, and Greenland. However, this term today is considered offensive. In Canada, it has been replaced with Inuit. Inuit is also used by the Indigenous peoples of Alaska and Russia, but they increasingly prefer to use the terms that they use for themselves, for instance, Yupik and Inupiaq. Given all of these linguistic changes since the late 1960s, what explains the prevalence of the term Indian in discussion of Indigenous politics in Canada? This can be explained through the Indian Act of 1876. Under this act, a person who qualifies as an Indian, or status Indian, under the law has certain entitlements that do not apply to non-Indians. The reason that this term is used is because until the Indian Act and the legal status of Indian are abolished, any analysis of Indigenous politics and Indigenous persons belonging to these legal categories cannot avoid using these terms, regardless of the changes in how these people refer to themselves, as well as how advocacy groups, governments, and academics refer to them. As we'll see today, Those bands that live on Indian reserves are subject to special legal provisions. This is the importance of the legal category. And these provisions concern individual land ownership and transfer of those lands, the prohibition against mortgages on those lands, and numerous restrictions on the permissible economic activities on reserve lands. We'll explore this in more depth in later slides. The Indian Act of 1876 stipulated that an Indian was any male person of Indian blood who belonged to a band recognized by the federal government, and any children of such a person, or a woman married to such a person. As we'll see, this is a very patriarchal stipulation. A woman could acquire Indian status through marriage, but an Indian woman who married a non-Indian would lose her legal status. This patriarchal classification of who could be considered an Indian under the eyes of the government did not change until 1985. Finally, it was Bill C-31, which provided women who had lost their Indian status through marriage to a non-Indian, and any children through such unions, the right to apply for the Indian status they deserved. What we can see is that under the Indian Act, the federal government is the one that sets the rules that determine who is or who is not an Indian as a legal category. Is there any room then for self-government? Yes. At the same time that the federal government can set these designations, First Nations bands are also able to determine within certain limits who is entitled to be a band member and live on their reserve. And this is indeed an important aspect of Indigenous self-government, which is a topic we'll continue to explore today. Let's say more about how the government came to expand its categorization of Indigenous peoples to include Métis and Inuit individuals. The Inuit and Métis are officially grouped with the Indian people of Canada by Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. And this recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Prior to this, a Supreme Court decision in 1939 found that Inuit peoples had been excluded from the Indian Act, but that the court now found that the Inuit are Indians within the meaning of the 1867 British North America Act, which we now know as the Constitution Act of 1867. And despite the fact that at the time the federal government did not wish to assume responsibility for the welfare of the Inuit people, the Supreme Court found that it was obligated to under the terms of this 1867 Constitution Act. And so in this way, it was in 1939 that the Inuit people were first categorized under that legal category of Indigenous person, according to the government. And when we look more deeply at the distribution of Inuit people, what we see is that the concentration of Inuit people is in what we call the Inuit Nunanagat. And this is a collection of 4 northern regions of Canada, which you can see listed in the top 4 spots of this chart. The Inuvialuit region is in the Western Arctic of the Northwest Territories. Nunavut is the territory that has over 80% Indigenous, that is to say 80% Inuit population. Nunavik is the upper third portion of the province of Quebec. And Nunatsiavut is in Newfoundland, where there's also a significant population of Inuit people. And so we can see then that they are concentrated in these 4 areas, but that outside of these 4 regions, we also see significant numbers of Inuit people across Canada. Now let's discuss the Métis. The Métis is a term originally understood to be limited to the mixed blood descendants of unions between Indian women and Scots or French-speaking traders and settlers in the Red River region of Manitoba. This historical term, however, has been appropriated of late. Today, some people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry use this term, despite the fact that they do not have any connection to the early Western fur trade from which the term originates. And this explains why between 1996 and 2006, the number of self-identifying Métis doubled to nearly 400,000 individuals. Then between 2006 and 2016, this number rose to nearly 600,000, almost 2% of the Canadian population. And we can see that according to the 2016 census, Métis are spread across the entire country, but we see large numbers in the prairies, for instance in Alberta, Manitoba, as well as in Ontario and Quebec and Saskatchewan. Although Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 now incorporates the Métis into the legal definition of Indian according to the federal government, the Métis are still fighting for certain rights through the courts. Let's take the case of Manitoba Métis Federation versus Canada. In this 2013 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had failed to fulfill its land grant promises to the Métis under the Manitoba Act of 1870. As a result, negotiations between various levels of government and the Métis Nation concerning the reclamation of land rights continue to this day. In this photo, you can see the president as well as members of the Manitoba Métis Federation celebrating a legal victory. Another important recent court case regarding the Métis is Daniels v. Canada from 2016. In this case, the Supreme Court held that Métis persons, as well as non-status Indians, must be treated the same as status Indians under Canadian law. This is important. Now, it doesn't mean that they have Indian status under the Indian Act or that they have a right to the reserve system. Yet, Ottawa now has jurisdiction over the Métis as opposed to the provinces, which was previously the case, as well as over non-status Indians. And therefore, it has the same responsibilities for their welfare as it does for status Indians and the Inuit. And this opened the door to these groups being able to claim certain health and education benefits offered to status Indians, and possibly an exemption from certain taxes. Let's transition to the lengthiest of our 4 learning objectives for this lecture. We are going to track the evolution of Indigenous policy in Canada from the colonial period all the way to the present day. We're going to begin with this with an extended look at the reserve system. The Indian Act of 1876 says this about reserves. The term reserve means any tract or tracts of land set apart by a treaty or otherwise for the use or benefit of or granted to a particular band of Indians, of which the legal title is in the Crown, but which is unsurrendered and includes all the trees, wood, timber, soil, stone, minerals, metals, or other valuables thereon or therein. At the heart of this definition, and central to the dilemma of the reserve system, is the relationship of what we call paternalistic guardianship between the federal government and those living on reserves. Because the reserve land belongs to the Crown, virtually no legal or commercial transaction of any consequence can be undertaken by those living on a reserve without the permission of the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. This has engendered a dependency and a paternalistic relationship between the federal government and the reserve system. Before we say more about the consequences of this paternalistic relationship between the federal government and the reserve system, let's take a look at where the reserves are and how many there are. There are over 2,300 Indian reserves in Canada, with roughly 330,000 First Nations peoples residing in these reserves. About 2/3 of all reserves are located in the province where I am, in British Columbia. Together, The combined area of all of the reserves is about 28,000 square kilometers. For comparison, countries with similar sizes include Armenia, Albania, and Equatorial Guinea. Also, the combined area of all of the Hawaiian Islands is also about 28,000 square kilometers. About 3/4 of all reserves are uninhabited. And among those inhabited, most inhabited reserves have populations of fewer than 1,000 people. As I mentioned briefly when we were discussing the distribution of Indigenous peoples across Canada's most populated cities, most reserves actually tend to be in rural and remote areas. And more so, they cannot be reached by road in some cases. Important social and economic consequences of this include fewer job opportunities, the fact that residents are generally required to leave home to acquire education in both the secondary and post-secondary levels, and physical isolation that impedes an integration into the rest of society, although we'll see that this is also a point of pride of the reservation system. Nonetheless, the author of our textbook, Stephen Brooks, draws parallels between Canada's reserve system and the South African apartheid system, which was a system of white minority domination and control over a black majority population in South Africa. Brooks draws this comparison because of the combination of enormous disparity between life on the reserves compared to mainstream Canadian society, as well as the racial basis for the physical segregation of Indigenous peoples. What we will also see is that this system, so similar to apartheid in Brooks's view, has engendered higher rates of suicide, alcoholism, violent death, unemployment, crowded housing conditions, and infant mortality. We're going to examine a few of these trends today, and this is a warning to anyone sensitive about the issue of suicide. You may want to fast forward a few minutes past the next slide, where we are going to take a deeper look at the rates of suicide on Indigenous reserves and among the non-Indigenous population in Canada. The average life expectancy of those who live on reserves is significantly lower than the Canadian norm. We see this not only in the higher suicide rate among males who live on reserves, as this graph shows, but we'll also see it later in today's lecture with the history of missing women and girls from Indigenous communities. Let's focus for a moment on this graph. It tells a very alarming story of the high incidence of suicide among men living on First Nations reserves. What we can see is that the rate is highest for Indigenous youth on the reserves. And while it declines into later life, it doesn't approach anything close to comparable with the non-Indigenous norm across Canada until after 45 years of age. Even then, it is still markedly higher than the Canadian norm. We are going to see that one of the aspects of isolation is a higher rate of suicide, a higher rate of alcoholism, tied partially to less access to social and economic opportunities compared to the rest of Canada. The decreased access on reserves to social and economic opportunities is a fact that is quickly pointed out by critics of the Indian Act. The paternalism of the Indian Act is on clear display, these critics argue, in the fact that band members may not sell any part of the reserve. The federal government retains the ultimate authority to grant timber cutting licenses and to establish their terms, although we will explore this issue in more depth at the end of today's lecture. And reserve land may not be used as security for loans. Taken together, this lack of opportunities, the higher rates of suicide, of alcoholism, and lower life expectancies, all of these grim facts about life on reserves makes it somewhat surprising that when the Liberal government proposed in 1969 to abolish reserves, the leadership of First Nations communities said no. And in fact, this response was a vehement no. What explains this? We will look at this in more depth near the end of today's lecture. But first, we can say, as a Canadian historian has written, reserves nurture a sense of history and culture where Indigenous languages, spiritual beliefs, and values are shared. The reserve is a physical and spiritual home, despite the privations that may exist therein. This begins to answer the question of why, despite all of the unfortunate realities about life on reserves, they still occupy an important place in Indigenous peoples' communities and in their self-identities and the preservation of their cultural traditions. This ability of the reserve system to maintain the linguistic, cultural, and religious traditions of Indigenous peoples across Canada is especially important in light of the fact that there are many pressures to assimilate to the dominant culture in Canada, which is a Euro-Canadian culture. And these pressures are much weaker on reserves as well as in the territory of Nunavut, where most of the population is Inuit. But for most Indigenous people across Canada, the retention of their culture is a challenge. We can see this in the fact that only a half dozen or so of the roughly 70 Indigenous languages that we looked at in week 1 of this course, only a half dozen or so of these continue to be spoken by significant numbers of people across Canada. Some of these include Cree, Ojibwe, Oji-Cree, and Dene. The rates of Indigenous language retention are low, except for among the Inuit. More specifically, among status Indians, about 1 in 5 say that they can speak an Indigenous language. But we can see that on reserves, the retention of Indigenous languages is higher because the rate is about 3 times greater among those living on reserves. So in this way, the reserve system, though there are privations that exist, the reserve system is clearly a way that Indigenous peoples can hold on to their cultural traditions in the face of a pressure to assimilate to the dominant Euro-Canadian society. In our continuing understanding of the evolution of Indigenous policy, let's go all the way back to the period of French colonial rule. And we'll see that under French colonial rule, there were 2 key principles in New France, and these principles would last all the way up until the beginning of the 7 Years' War in 1756. The first of these principles was assimilation. This involved the aggressive conversion of the Indigenous population to Christianity as a central objective of French colonial policy. And this was largely implemented through the missionary work of the Jesuits and other monks in the Franciscan order. The second principle underlying Indigenous policy in New France was the non-recognition of Indigenous land rights. No official recognition of any Indigenous title to or other proprietary interest in the lands that Indigenous people had long occupied and used before European settlement. These 2 principles were clear incidents of colonial domination, the assimilation of Indigenous peoples, and the non-recognition of their historical land rights. However, the French position was motivated more by colonial and imperial expansion and the extraction of resources than it was on some sort of cynical hatred of Indigenous peoples. And we can see this at least evidenced in the 1627 Charter of the Company of 100 Associates, which declared that a converted Indigenous person had the status and rights of a naturalized French citizen. Of course, these naturalized citizenship rights were only achievable through the aggressive conversion through assimilation and the non-recognition of land rights. The end of the 7 Years' War saw the defeat of French colonial forces at the hands of the British, and the resulting British Royal Proclamation of 1763 recognized basic Indigenous rights. And it did this because it spoke of the sovereignty, protection, and dominion of the crown in relation to the several nations or tribes of Indians who live under our protection. What does this mean? Well, first, it means that a proprietary indigenous interest in the land and the traditional historical uses of that land was acknowledged, but only within the broader context of British sovereignty. By that, I mean that Britain maintained the colonial expectation that European settlement, especially British settlement, would continue to expand into traditional indigenous lands. Unlike the French, who rejected any indigenous title to their historically occupied lands, the British did at least believe that they were required to compensate the indigenous population for land that was formally alienated through treaties and other purchase agreements. This was a clear shift in how the French colonial forces and government had seen indigenous title to their lands, but it is far from a system that could be perceived as just. And we are not nearly done with the Royal Proclamation, as well as indigenous title to historically occupied lands. These two subjects are going to dominate much of the last part of today's lecture. Not only did a change from French to British colonial rule change how indigenous title was recognized, it also meant that the British efforts at assimilation were less rigorous than the French had been. British colonial authorities were more interested in ensuring that indigenous communities did not impede the growth and development of the colonies. The policy of reserving certain lands for occupation and use by Indians was practiced, and as we've already seen, it continued after Confederation through the reserve system. Under the British North America Act of 1867, later renamed the Constitution Act, Ottawa was assigned exclusive legislative authority over Indian affairs. This was not going to be a territorial matter or a provincial matter, but rather a federal issue. And soon after Confederation, the federal government passed the Indian Act of 1876. And this legislation consolidated the dependency relationship between First Nations and the state. And this was a significant development in the nation-to-nation treaty relationship between Indigenous bands and peoples and the Canadian Confederation. The paternalism inherent in the Indian Act of 1876 is easy to recognize. Indians living on reserves were placed under almost total control of the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, whose powers would be exercised by federal bureaucrats in Ottawa, as well as by agents in the field. This led to restrictions on the very movement of Indigenous peoples off of their reserve lands. Economically speaking, all money paid by the federal government to members of a reserve, or the money generated from economic activities on reserve lands, was controlled by the federal authorities. And for these reasons, it was impossible for those living on reserves to assume responsibility as well as control over the social and economic development of their communities. The previous discussions of the lack of education, income, and employment opportunities on reserve lands is clearly tied to these paternalistic stipulations within the Indian Act of 1876. Aside from paternalism, the Indian Act of 1876 also had assimilationist effects on Indigenous peoples. There were extremely limited powers of self-government assigned to reserve bands, and these powers were subject to approval by Ottawa. And they were exercised through band councils and chiefs elected for 3-year terms. While this at first might seem unobjectionable, it ignores the fact that these were democratic practices of European origin that were expected to replace Indigenous traditions of governance that involved, in some cases, traditional and inherited leadership. In other cases, for instance, with the example of the orally transmitted Great Law of Peace, which was the constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy, which stretched into some of the Great Lake regions of Canada, there had already been a tradition of an orally transmitted constitution dating back to the late 17th century. And so these democratic practices of leadership selection were starting to supplant the already existing practices that we had seen in First Nations communities of that time. The goal of assimilation was even more apparent, however, in the Indian Act sections on citizenship and voting. And this is because there was no automatic right to Canadian citizenship for status Indians before 1960. That's when an amendment to the Act finally extended citizenship and the right to vote to all Indigenous people. But the struggle for suffrage for Indigenous peoples was a long one. In addition to the assimilationist effects of the Indian Act, more broadly speaking, until well into the latter half of the 20th century, it was widely assumed that Indigenous peoples would abandon their languages, customs, religions, and lifestyles, and be absorbed into Euro-Canadian society. Not only that this would happen, but that this would be a beneficial development for Indigenous peoples, as well as the broader Canadian society. And to achieve this assimilationist objective, multiple different types of sanctions were used to suppress Indigenous culture. We're going to look at a few prominent examples of these, and the combination of these assimilationist practices and policies resulted in what the Canadian government has called a cultural genocide. It referred to this as cultural genocide in a 1995 Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we'll discuss a little later today. The first of the sanctions that we are going to talk about to force assimilation was a ban on the potlatch ceremony. And this ban on this important Indigenous tradition lasted for 66 years, from 1885 to 1951. What was the potlatch ceremony? Practiced more commonly in the Western territories, such as British Columbia and the Yukon, the purpose of the potlatch was to redistribute wealth, establish social status, trace family lineages, pass on ceremonial names and hereditary positions, recognize rights and privileges, and through all of this, to fulfill social obligations to the community. The ceremony itself is performed with dancing, singing, and the use of elaborate regalia. And notice the present tense is. This ceremony, though banned for over 60 years, is still being practiced and indeed revitalized today. However, in the late 19th century, to white settlers, the potlatch ceremony seemed wasteful and excessive, and it appeared to violate what is referred to as the Protestant work ethic of industry and sobriety. And it supposedly constituted evidence of the savagery and depravity of First Nations peoples. You can see the blatant racism and cynicism in these white settler analyses and descriptions of an important religious and cultural tradition of the potlatch ceremony. And so the potlatch ban, with its 66-year ban against the practice, also carried a punishment of 2 to 6 months incarceration for anyone participating in or encouraging the hosting and holding of a potlatch ceremony. Importantly, however, the potlatch has been revitalized in many First Nations communities. And I made sure to include photos of potlatch ceremonies on this slide, both in black and white, representing the historical origins of the potlatch, although this black and white photo is from 1980, and a more recent photo from 2014 of a potlatch ceremony in the same Indigenous community. The potlatch was banned as a way to try to stamp out Indigenous practices, cultures, traditions, and regalia. but it was not successful in the long run as the potlatch ceremony has reappeared. The clearest example of cultural genocide promoted through government policy is the residential school system. Residential schools were government-sponsored boarding schools that were operated by Christian churches and funded by the government. They had the intent to aggressively assimilate Indigenous youth into Euro-Canadian culture. And so from 1831 to 1996, there were over 130 residential schools. Most of the residential schools were opened after 1870, and 1931 was the year with the most residential schools with the largest number of students in them. Overall, an estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend these residential schools. And while there, for 10 months to 12 months of the year, children were prohibited from using their Indigenous languages, from wearing their Indigenous dress, and from practicing their Indigenous traditions and cultures. And all of this was under pain of severe punishment. One particularly heartbreaking example comes from memoirs of a man who was forced into the residential school system at the age of 12 in 1886. And he found that when he arrived, he had lost his Indigenous name and was given a Christian name instead. And his ceremonial braids were also shorn close to his head. And in his cultural traditions, the shearing off of braids was something only done when one was in mourning for the loss, the death of a relative. And the closer you cut your hair, the more grief and mourning was expressed because it was the closer relation that you had lost. And so in his memoirs, this Indigenous child remembers reflecting in isolation when he looked at the mirror and saw that he had lost his braids, whether perhaps his mother had died back in his community that he had been separated from, and which he could not communicate with in an important form, as we'll see. Indigenous children were not allowed to write home in any language other than English, and their families usually couldn't read this language. Conditions at residential schools were substandard and repressive, to say the least. Students, as I mentioned, were kept away from their families for at least 10 months a year, sometimes 12 months a year, and were only allowed to write home in English. Until the late 1950s, the residential schools used a half-and-half program where students received education for the first half of the day, but then were forced to labor for the second half of each school day, mostly to keep costs down at these underfunded schools. Punishments for misbehavior or for the use of Indigenous languages, practices, customs, or traditions were often excessive, including beatings, chainings, and confinement. Even more tragically, students also suffered sexual abuse by predators who were employed at these residential schools. Furthermore, an estimated 3,000 to 6,000 or more children died at residential schools. The causes of death were often related to malnutrition and the sorts of diseases that malnourished individuals were more likely, malnourished children, I should say, were more likely to contract and die from. These included influenza, tuberculosis, measles, whooping cough, and pneumonia. Overall, the grim human toll, not just the assimilationist effects of the cultural genocidal practices of residential schools, but also the human toll and the cost of life and abuse and physical and sexual violence that children were made to experience at these schools where they were separated from their families. This is a reason why residential schools leave such a terrible mark on the history of Canada, and why the government has apologized for this. And we'll talk about the government apology later today. The assimilationist ethic that motivated the residential schools also produced what we refer to as the 60s scoop. And this was the removal of Indigenous children from their homes in the 1960s and their adoption by non-Indigenous families across the country as well as in the United States. As many as 20,000 children were removed by child welfare workers because it was just assumed to be in their best interest to be removed from their Indigenous communities and families and then adopted by non-Indigenous Canadians and Americans. And what's most insidious about this policy is that it wasn't an official policy at all. Rather, it was just the culmination of a widely held societal belief that it was in the best interest of Indigenous peoples to have their children assimilated into the dominant Euro-Canadian traditions and cultures. And so, even in the absence of an official government policy, maybe as many as 20,000 children were removed in a single decade from their families and then adopted into other families. Only recently, in the Ontario Superior Court case of Brown v. Canada, were $800 million awarded to the survivors of the 60s scoop. This is one of a few instances of financial restitution in the form of reparations that we will talk about in today's lecture. At the end of the 1960s, the Liberal government of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau would introduce a proposed reform that would start an important debate in Indigenous politics. Pierre Trudeau's Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, who himself would go on to be the 20th Prime Minister of Canada in the 1990s, introduced the 1969 White Paper, the Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy. This proposed the total dismantling of the Indian Affairs bureaucracy, an end to the reserve system, the abolition of different status for Indians under the law, and the transfer of responsibility for the education, healthcare, and social needs of Indigenous citizens away from the federal government and to the provinces. This massive overhaul proposed by the White Paper would be the end of the nation-to-nation treaty relationship between First Nations and the Crown, and, as it would be called by critics, an abrogation, a breaking of the government's responsibilities for Indigenous welfare. These are federal responsibilities that had been exercised even previous to Confederation and then accelerated after Confederation, which were now being proposed to be abolished. And the argument of the Liberal government was that special treatment, the recognition of Indians as a different class, as a different legal category, this special treatment had made of the Indians a community disadvantaged and apart. And although the White Paper diagnosed many of the actual ills and many of the actual problems and privations that were being experienced on reserves as well as by non-reserve Indigenous peoples, the solution of abolishing the government's responsibilities to those people was not something that the Indigenous communities were prepared to accept. The reaction to the White Paper was overwhelmingly negative. The White Paper was seen as patronizing, and it marked a critical juncture in the politicization of the Indigenous movement in Canada. The most controversial clause of the White Paper included the proposals concerning treaty obligations and land claims, where historical treaties the federal government was signaling should not be expected to define the relationship between First Nations and the government of Canada forever. In a contemporaneous article widely published in Canada by the magazine Maclean's, Chief Harold Cardinal said, "Before I can be a usefully participating and contributing citizen of Canada, I must be allowed to develop a sense of pride and confidence in myself as an Indian. I must be allowed to be a red tile in the Canadian mosaic, not forced to become an unseen white tile. If the Canadian cultural mosaic was indeed, as the cultural cliche goes, a mosaic of cultural diversity and citizenship and multiculturalism, then the Indian people should be afforded a special status, should be given their own specific red tile that they could be proud of and place within the broader Canadian mosaic. Said a little more directly, also by Chief Harold Cardinal, for the Indian to survive, the government says he must become a good little brown white man. The trajectory of government policy since the ill-fated White Paper has been in the direction of recognizing, in the law and in the Constitution, the separate and distinct status of Indigenous communities within Canadian society. And so self-government today is endorsed by all of the major organizations representing Indigenous peoples and is accepted as both fair and desirable by many Canadians, although most Canadians have little idea of what this might involve in practice. And practically speaking, governments and First Nations communities are still negotiating the specifics of what self-government looks like. Let's take a recent case study as an example. A recent example of government policy on Indigenous self-government is the Tla-Amin Final Agreement that went into effect in 2016, but was negotiated for years beforehand. This agreement was negotiated by three parties: the government, the BC government, by that I mean the federal government as well as the BC government, and the Tla-Amin First Nation. And this final agreement provided certain rights and benefits and self-government over the lands, resources, and members of the historical Tla-Amin First Nation. And we can see the area that is now given over to self-government by this First Nation extending along Vancouver Island and into British Columbia. So the future of self-government will likely take the form of agreements such as these, negotiated by First Nations communities, clearly delineating the rights and responsibilities on their lands and regarding their resources and their members. But we will also see that much is going to be decided by the responses to government inquiries and commissions and the recommendations made therein, as well as with the legal battles that are taking place in the courts of Canada over the last 50 years and continuing to the present day. These are going to be the focus of our next learning objective that we are going to accomplish today. In order to solve seemingly intractable or unsolvable policy problems, the federal government often appoints major commissions and inquiries. And nowhere is this more true than on the issue of Indigenous politics and Indigenous peoples. We are going to talk about in the coming slides a series of major inquiries into Indigenous issues that the federal government has appointed over the past half century. Let's begin in the late 1960s with the Hawthorne Report. The Hawthorne Report examined the economic, political, and educational situation of First Nations, and it concluded that assimilation was not desirable, and that Indigenous peoples should be understood and treated as citizens plus, that is to say, as Canadian citizens with additional treaty rights and benefits. It was all the more shocking then when 2 years later, the Liberal government of Pierre Trudeau introduced the White Paper, which had the opposite proposal, which was to abolish that special designation. And so we can already see that when the government holds a commission and inquiry, the recommendations made by those commissions and at the end of those inquiries are not always binding. And as we will see, the implementation of these recommendations is often done in fits and starts. And so we'll go over that in the coming slides. The next commission or inquiry of note was the Berger Inquiry, also known as as the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry. And this was conducted between 1974 and 1977. The significance of the Berger inquiry is that it set a new standard for all future inquiries because it traveled to remote indigenous communities. And it did this for the purposes of gathering testimony from the peoples that lived in these communities. It also delayed the construction of a pipeline, and it also captured wide media attention and the public imagination in non-Indigenous Canada. A best-selling book was written after the Berger inquiry was conducted, and this put Indigenous peoples and the testimonies and oral transmission of people from these communities into the spotlight across Canada. Continuing with our exploration of government commissions and inquiries into Indigenous issues, we have the 1983 Penner Report. The report of the Special Parliamentary Committee on Indian Self-Government urged the government to facilitate Indigenous self-government on Indigenous lands. However, a continuing theme with these commissions and inquiries is that the results are not often implemented. And indeed, the recommendations of the Penner Report were ignored when the Mulroney Conservatives won the election and formed government the following year. Moving forward to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, abbreviated as RCAP, this took place from 1991 to 1996, and it drew on the work of earlier inquiries, and it made a number of recommendations, including some new ones, such as a separate Indigenous House of Parliament. We are going to explore in much greater detail later in today's lecture those specific recommendations of the RCAP that were enacted, as well as the many others that were not. Moving forward, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, TRC, that took place between 2008 and 2015, investigated the history and individual and cultural consequences of the Indian residential schools in Canada, and it included 94 calls to action. The focus was on the need to know about and remember past injustices and emphasize a way forward in reconciliation for all peoples in Canada, and especially those who suffered in the Indian residential school system. At the University of British Columbia, there have been a few notable recent attempts to improve this process and to facilitate this process of reconciliation. First off, there is the new Center for Indigenous Dialogue on Residential Schools, which was built between the Kerner and I.K. Barber libraries. I was not able to visit this new Center for Dialogue on Reconciliation following the residential schools before the global pandemic hit, but I look forward to visiting once all of UBC is open back up. Also, this other photo on this slide shows the raising of the reconciliation pole. Just out of this shot is the Vantage College building. The reconciliation pole is visible very clearly from Vantage College, and it is a totem that is recognizing the suffering of the Indigenous children who went through these residential schools, as well as the hope for a reconciliation within a Canadian community that involves the special recognition of Indigenous communities as sovereign and self-governing. Another important inquiry by the federal government was the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This inquiry took place between 2015 and 2019, and the conclusion of the inquiry was that the astounding number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls over the past few decades represented a clear case of genocide against First Nations peoples. And you can see here a march against what are known as the Stolen Sisters, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as a piece of art called Vanished by the artist Melissa Johns. And the figure that is supposed to represent the vanishing of the missing and murdered Indigenous women was modeled after a young woman named Maisie Ojek, who at the age of 16 disappeared in 2008. This national inquiry was delayed by the Harper government, which declined to appoint the commission. However, this hidden human rights crisis within Canada is finally getting the recognition and the attention that it deserves. Of all these commissions and inquiries, the mandate of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, otherwise known as RCAP, which took place from 1991 to 1996, was the most expansive. Its 3,300-page report spread across multiple policy areas. And we're going to look at the various recommendations it made, including those that have been enacted, as well as those that have been ignored. Overall, the RCAP called for the creation of an Indigenous third order of government whose existence would be based on the acknowledgement by the federal government in Ottawa, as well as by the provincial governments, that the inherent right of self-government is a treaty right guaranteed by the Constitution of Canada. This is a fundamental notion underlying the Indigenous people's support and advocacy for meaningful structures of Indigenous self-government, and, as we'll see, a system of divided sovereignty, where Indigenous peoples have sovereignty within their communities, but also within the broader community of Canada. Other recommendations in the expansive 3,000-page report from the RCAP include an offer of dual citizenship to be both Canadian citizens and citizens of Indigenous communities. Another recommendation was that the government should issue an official admission of the wrongs done to Indigenous peoples. Also, a recommendation that an Indigenous Parliament should be established with an advisory role regarding all legislation that would affect Indigenous persons. The recommendations continued. One recommendation was that the government should negotiate with Métis representatives on self-government and allocation of an adequate land base. We've already discussed these negotiations in our discussion of the legal cases that the Métis pursued in order to make amends for the failed allocation of land under a Manitoba agreement from 1870. Another recommendation of the RCAP is that Indigenous representatives should be participants in all future talks on constitutional reform, with veto rights over any changes to Indigenous rights. Also, the RCAP recommended that much more money should be spent on Indigenous programs. Of these many recommendations of the RCAP, some of them have been acted on. For instance, the creation of Nunavut in 1999 as a federally recognized territory with its own legislative assembly and its own premier and an 85% Inuit population, Nunavut represents a very significant form of public self-government for Indigenous peoples within Canada. Additionally, there have been $5 billion in financial restitution and reparations paid to the thousands of First Nations persons who experienced mistreatment and abuse in the residential school system. This was also accompanied by an official apology by the Stephen Harper Conservative government in 2008. And this formal apology was issued in Parliament to the victims of residential schools on behalf of the government. So some of the important RCAP recommendations have been implemented and seen significant results. Yet other RCAP recommendations have fallen through the cracks, have not yet materialized. In 2018, the Trudeau government promised legislation for relations between the federal government and Indigenous peoples that would involve a new recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework. But this has yet to materialize. What will be the future of the Trudeau government's approach to Indigenous policy, and whether such a new recognition and implementation of an Indigenous rights framework can be completed before the next federal election, which is most likely expected to take place sometime this year. The Trudeau government has been hesitant to embrace the divided sovereignty model advocated by the RCAP, which would place Indigenous sovereignty on par with the divide between Ottawa and the provinces. Most Canadians who approve of self-government have not thought out the ramifications. That is to say, most non-Indigenous Canadians who support self-government by Indigenous peoples have perhaps not thought out the full implications of this divided sovereignty model and how self-government and such a divided sovereignty model could be maintained within a broader unified Canadian community. Between 1867 and 2015, only 39 Indigenous persons were elected to the House of Commons as members of Parliament, or MPs. About 2/3 of these were elected since 1988. And this is only slightly more than 1% of all the MPs elected since 1867. This is a very small number. Of course, there have been important gains in the representation of First Nations people, and specifically First Nations women, in the House of Commons. On the left on this slide, we see a photo of Mumilak Kakak, who when elected was 25 years old and the representative for Nunavut to the House of Commons. On the right-hand side is Jody Wilson-Raybould, an independent representative and parliamentarian representing part of Vancouver. She was formerly the Attorney General within the Liberal government until a scandal in the Liberal government, known as the SNC-Lavalin scandal, caused Jody Wilson-Raybould to feel a necessity and a pressure to resign from the Liberal Party and form an independent seat. And this was because of pressures that Jody Wilson-Raybould felt to exert political pressure on a non-political position within the government. You can see more about this scandal by Googling the SNC-Lavalin affair. But overall, the prominence of Jody Wilson-Raybould on the national political scene is a clear improvement for the status of First Nations peoples and Indigenous persons within Parliament. However, overall, Parliament has not been the place where Indigenous peoples have been able to advance their political agenda, especially related to the land rights associated with their historically occupied lands. Instead, political influence can be exercised in other ways and through other forms than just the House of Commons. Specifically, Indigenous Canadians' ability to affect policy has depended far more on their use of the courts. And it is these legal battles that will occupy us for the remainder of today's lecture. Many of the most salient court battles of the last 50 years have centered on ownership and control over the lands to which Indigenous peoples claim a historic right, and which Indigenous peoples argue are necessary for the survival of the traditional Indigenous culture. Such matters as Indigenous hunting and fishing rights were recognized in early treaties. However, most leaders within Indigenous communities deny any sovereignty of the Canadian state over them and their land. Some of the most contentious protests and battles between First Nations peoples and the federal government have occurred over the issue of Indigenous land rights, including the development of land, including pipelines and mining and fishing. To fully understand the legal battles over Indigenous title to their historically occupied lands, we need to return to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Remember, this was the British proclamation issued at the end of the 7 Years' War, when the British took over what was formerly New France. And in this royal proclamation, the British took some responsibility for the welfare of the Indigenous people, and it also recognized their land rights and proprietary interests in those lands. And importantly, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was formally incorporated into the Canadian Constitution through Section 25 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or the Constitution Act of 1982. Even though this has been institutionalized and codified in the Canadian Constitution, it's not clear whether this recognizes unqualified or unrestricted Indigenous sovereignty over their historically occupied lands. At a minimum, it's clear that it does establish an implicit recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, and it seems to establish the right of Indigenous peoples to compensation for land transferred by them to the Crown. As we will see in the remaining slides in today's lecture, the courts have played a key role in determining questions raised by the words of the Royal Proclamation. Interpreting the Royal Proclamation has been a crucial job of the courts lately. And this has established, through a series of opinions and decisions, crucial precedent regarding Indigenous land rights. And we will examine the development and evolution of this precedent now. Let's begin our analysis with the important cases clarifying the language from the Royal Proclamation and the impacts that has on Indigenous title to their historically occupied lands. We begin with Calder et al. Versus Attorney General of British Columbia. This was a 1973 case, and even though the Indigenous band bringing the lawsuit to the court lost this case, the important development here is that 6 of the 7 Supreme Court judges recognized the concept of what we call, or at least what was called then, Aboriginal title. Again, the term Aboriginal has fallen out of favor of late, but we still are going to use it in the coming slides because it's part of the language of these legal opinions. And so the title, the Indigenous title to this land, stems from the fact that the owners of the interest, or the owners of the property, the land, have from time immemorial occupied the areas in question. Similarly, in Hamlet of Baker Lake versus Minister of Indian Affairs, in 1980, the court reaffirmed the Calder acknowledgement of Indigenous title, or Aboriginal title, and this emanated not from the British. It wasn't the British who were responsible for giving this title to the Indigenous peoples, but rather from the historical fact of their occupation of these lands for centuries and indeed for millennia. The court argued in the Hamlet of Baker Lake case, the law of Canada recognizes the existence of an Aboriginal title independent of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 or any other prerogative act or legislation. The title is theirs because it's always been theirs, not because the British colonial government or the Canadian Confederation acknowledged it as such. Building on this precedent, Regina v. Sparrow in 1990 continued the reasoning found in the Calder and Baker Lake opinions. The court held here that Indigenous rights are pre-existing rights, and that they are not created by government legislation, and these rights will continue to exist until they are explicitly extinguished by legislation. So taken together, these 3 cases build important precedent in the acknowledgement of Indigenous title as emanating from the historical occupation of lands, and yes, is supported by the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and subsequent laws like the Indian Act and the incorporation of the Indian Act into the Constitution Act. However, all of this is secondary to the fact that the First Nations peoples, the Inuit peoples, the Métis, they have occupied these lands for longer than the British colonial government and the Canadian Confederation. And for that reason, they have this Indigenous title and proprietary interest in their lands. And so they need to be consulted and negotiated with when the government seeks to develop or extract resources from these lands. And so much of these cases regard that process of consultation and negotiation that is required after we have acknowledged that Indigenous title exists. The next significant case concerning Indigenous title occurred in 1997, when the Supreme Court held that Section 35 of the 1982 Constitution Act protected Indigenous ancestral land, and that no provincial government could extinguish this right. Very importantly, this decision established that the oral historical accounts of an Indigenous people are admissible in court. They can be included in court as proof of land occupancy and use. This is crucial because the lower courts had previously refused to accept the oral historical accounts. However, much of the traditional culture and much of the government practices or communal governance and self-governance practices of Indigenous peoples were transmitted not in written form, but orally. And so the inclusion of this important source of historical documentation of Indigenous occupation and land use is now, because of this 1997 case, admissible in all future cases about Indigenous title to historically occupied lands. At the same time, this 1997 decision also acknowledged limitations on Indigenous title. Indigenous use is restricted to traditional activities, and this does not include resource extraction and exploitation. If the ancestral use of the land was for certain types of hunting and fishing, and then that's what it can currently be used for as well. So for instance, the Indigenous community cannot then decide to develop and exploit the resources of their land that, for instance, a federal pipeline project would have done instead. But rather, as long as these lands are used in traditional fashion, they are maintained by Indigenous title. The nature of negotiation, consultation, and deliberation between First Nation groups and the Canadian federal government was deepened and transformed by a 2014 case. And the decision here had the practical effect of granting legal title to 1,700 square kilometers in the interior of BC to a First Nation group. The court's ruling also established the principle that the Crown is obliged to consult with Indigenous groups that have been determined to have ownership rights over the land before approving any sort of development on that land, including logging, pipeline development, and mining. The knowledge that there is a potential Indigenous claim, even in the absence of specific proof of a claim, is already sufficient to establish this obligation to consult and negotiate with the First Nations people in question. So this was an important case in expanding the rights of negotiation and consultation. But as we'll see, it does not necessarily mean that Indigenous groups will always get the outcome that they want as a result of these consultations and negotiations with the government. And that's precisely what was established by a 2017 opinion. Following the previous opinion, the court in 2017 confirmed that there exists in law a duty to consult with Indigenous groups whose lands are affected by economic development. But crucially, there is no absolute Indigenous right of veto over such developments. The court wrote, Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 guarantees a process of consultation, not a particular result. So as we can see, the legal battles have clarified the language of the Royal Proclamation, and they have developed an understanding of the explicit right of Indigenous title extending back because of the historical fact of occupation of those lands. And it has also developed a process that has given expanded powers in negotiation and consultation between Indigenous groups, First Nations peoples, and the Canadian government. But it has established that this consultation is a process and not a guaranteed right of veto of First Nations peoples over proposed developments on their lands. Let's wrap up today's lecture with some concluding thoughts on the future of Indigenous self-government in Canada. While virtually all Indigenous group spokespersons express support for Indigenous self-government, most advocate some form of self-determination that would be realized within the context of the Canadian state. But what would determine the nature of such an arrangement? What would it look like? And how do Indigenous and non-Indigenous visions of divided sovereignty compare with one another, and how can they be bridged with one another in the coming decades? Among the important topics to consider are self-government agreements, such as the Tla-Amin Final Agreement of 2016, and as well as any additional court cases that add to the collection of precedent regarding Indigenous title to ancestral lands and the proprietary use of those lands. As we see the development of these two issues among other of the unenacted recommendations of the RCAP, the picture of the future of Indigenous self-government will continue to materialize before our very eyes. And so it's important that we understand the stakes of Indigenous politics in Canada, the many people involved, the First Nations individuals, as well as the federal government and provincial governments negotiating and consulting with the First Nations peoples, and the legal mechanisms available to First Nations peoples, as well as the commissions and inquiries appointed by the government. These have been the topics that we have focused on today. And we have also emphasized the historical oppression through the relationship of colonial domination that the First Nations peoples and Indigenous peoples in Canada have been forced to withstand from the French, British, and Canadian governments. And so, as we move forward to our lecture reflection today, based on the material from today's lecture, and the assigned readings in Stephen Brooks' Chapter 16 of Canadian Democracy, please write a 7 to 10 sentence response to the following question. Considering Canadian government actions in the second half of the 20th century to address Indigenous demands for autonomy and self-government, what does decolonization look like in Canada? What do I mean by decolonization? If we can think of the assimilationist policies of the potlatch ban and the residential school system and the 60s scoop and the centuries of assimilationist pressures and non or incomplete recognition of Indigenous title, these are all examples of the colonization of Indigenous peoples across Canada. And so as we begin to dismantle these colonial structures of assimilation and colonial domination, we need an active process of decolonization. And part of this has been specific government action. Of course, much of it has also been undertaken by advocacy groups, by Indigenous peoples themselves, by non-Indigenous allies of Indigenous peoples. And so there are many levels to decolonization. What I'm asking for in this lecture reflection is your understanding of the government's options and the government's approach to decolonization. What has it looked like? What concrete examples of decolonization did you see in today's lecture? And what might be the future of decolonization efforts by the Canadian government to increase the autonomy and self-governance of Indigenous peoples across all of Canada? As always, please use your own words and practice careful paraphrasing, and submit your response to turnitin.com by January 27th, before midnight Pacific Standard Time. Next week, what's on tap? Our lecture topic will be the Constitution, laws and conventions, and a queen. Why is Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau sitting next to Queen Elizabeth II at a very important signing ceremony in 1982? And what was the historical relationship between the Canadian government and the British Crown that led to this important moment? We'll begin to uncover the whole story in next week's lecture on the Constitution. Until then, be well, be safe, take care of each other, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.